Welcome to the sixth and last lecture in this series of Locke lectures that Bob Brandom's giving. We'll follow our usual schedule. Bob will give his lecture, we'll break for coffee, we'll reassemble for a response by Sebastian Riddle of the University of Basel, and then it will be open discussion, and then this wonderful 6 days of philosophy will be over. I think before we start, it might be appropriate if I were to say just a few words of thanks. First and foremost, obviously, to Bob himself for showing up and giving these lectures on this extraordinarily demanding schedule of all 6 lectures in 3 days, and for enlightening us and responding to questions with his accustomed grace and good humor. Secondarily, perhaps, to, well, not perhaps, and not even secondarily, but it's just an ordering. It's not a normative ordering. To Jaroslav Peregrin and Permin Stekler for all the organizational work that they put into making these 6 days, the School of Inferentialism, the Locke lectures, possible. I think we owe them a considerable debt of gratitude. And finally, of course, I should mention, in terms of funding this wonderful occasion, all this was made possible through the generosity of the Andrew Mellon Foundation. So thanks to Bob, thanks to Jaroslav and Permin, thanks to that wonderful person Bob calls his Uncle Andy, and thanks to everyone who participated as commentators, as lecturers in the school, as questioners, as audience. I think I can say that we've all had a wonderful and a very productive time. So I think it's appropriate at this point that we thank the people who made this possible. Bob, the floor is yours.
Well, as you probably noticed, the title of this final lecture is Intentionality as a Pragmatically Mediated Semantic Relation. I hope at least by now the phrase pragmatically mediated semantic relation means something. At least I've been chanting it for a while. But I don't suppose it's obvious how one could think of intentionality that way. So that's what I hope to explain. Under the banner of analytic pragmatism, I've been illustrating how deploying the meta-vocabulary of meaning-use analysis can both broaden our understanding of possible kinds of semantic analysis and help turn contemporary pragmatism from a primarily critical into a more constructive instrument, from a weapon suitable for the heavy, heroic, but only occasional work of slaying dragons of conceptual confusion, into a tool adapted for everyday domestic, analytical, and theoretical use. As its name implies, the broader sort of analysis that I've been recommending considers relations between meaning and use, between vocabularies and practices or abilities. The principal complex resultant meaning-use relation I focused on is the one that obtains when one vocabulary is elaborated from and explicating of, LX for short, some practices or abilities that are PV sufficient to deploy another vocabulary. This, I've argued, is the genus of which logical vocabulary is a species. In my 4th lecture, I showed how modal vocabulary and the vocabulary used to discuss specifically conceptual norms can be understood and introduced this way. Both algorithmic decomposition and complex meaning-use relations are not only analogous to the logical relations appealed to by semantic logicism, but are important for understanding why logical vocabulary deserves the special role it has traditionally been taken to play in semantic analysis. It's high time, however, to look more closely at the claim that the topic I've been addressing deserves to be called semantic analysis in the first place. After all, I've so far not said anything at all about word-world relations, nor about representation. And the formal incompatibility semantics I presented last time is notable in part precisely for the fact that it does not employ a notion of truth. I have, to be sure, as promised in the title of the lectures, talked about saying and doing, and about some of their relations, about the kind of doings that are sayings, and about the kind of sayings that specify that kind of doing. But my talk of vocabularies and the practices of deploying them can make it look as though all that's in play is words and their use. If the world gets left out of the story, what justification could there be for saying that meaning has not been? And if a slide has been initiated in lining up saying and doing with meaning and use, it would seem only to have been accelerated by my practice of talking about both in terms of this distinction between semantics and pragmatics. The use of the term pragmatics to encompass meaning-conferring aspects of use is non-standard, though I think it's fairly straightforwardly motivatable. But in what sense, it might be asked, have the meanings of the vocabularies I've addressed been under discussion if the relations between those words and the world that using them to say something consists in talking about don't come into view? Doesn't the story I've been telling remain too resolutely on the word side of the word-world divide? The short answer is that while at least some kinds of representings, for instance linguistic utterance tokenings thought of as mere sign designs, items or events in the natural order, Wittgenstein's signpost considered just as a piece of wood, can intelligibly be specified independently of what they represent, when properly conceived, practices and abilities are not the kind of thing that can be separated from the objects they involve in the way necessary for them to fall on the word side of a word-world gulf. Engaging in discursive practices and exercising discursive abilities is using words to say and mean something, hence to talk about items in the world. Those practices, the exercise of those abilities, those uses, establish semantic relations between words and the world. This is one of the big ideas that traditional pragmatism brings to philosophical thought about semantics. Don't look, to begin with, to the relation between representings and representeds, but to the nature of the doing, the process that institutes, inter alia, that relation. It's an idea that's explicit in Dewey, and it's at least implicit in Wittgenstein. This pragmatist privileging of process over relation in the order of semantic explanation is worth looking at a little more closely. It can be thought of in terms of a nested sequence of claims. First, a founding idea of pragmatism is that the most fundamental kind of intentionality, and here I mean in the sense of directedness towards objects, is the practical involvement with objects exhibited by a sentient creature dealing skillfully with its world. Second, the most basic form of such activity is a test-operate, test-exit cycle, a tote cycle, of perception, performance, assessment of the results of the performance, and further performance. That is, a process or practice consisting of an open-ended sequence of feedback-governed performances. It includes both what a predator does in stalking its prey and what a builder does in constructing a house. As we've seen, often a practice or ability in this sense can show up as complex, in that a suitably rich VP-sufficient metavocabulary can specify it as the algorithmic elaboration of more basic, reliable differential responsive dispositions. Doing so displays its structure as comprising a sequence of simpler doings, as exhibiting a planned structure, or as implementing a conditional branch schedule algorithm. Feedback-governed processes, practices, and abilities exhibiting this sort of complexity cannot, in principle, be specified without reference to the changes in the world that are both produced by the system's responses and responded to within each loop in the tote cycle. This fact underlies another important pragmatist claim. This is the third one. Feedback-governed practices are thick, in the sense of essentially involving objects, events, and worldly states of affairs. Bits of the world are incorporated in such practices, in the exercise of such abilities. In this regard, they contrast with words and sentences considered merely as sign designs or items in the natural world, which are thin in that they can be specified independently of a specification of the objects or states of affairs that they refer to or represent. This difference is, I think properly, put forward as one of the cardinal advantages of approaching semantics from a pragmatist direction. As I've indicated, I think it too should be understood in terms of features of the vocabularies that are VP sufficient to specify the practices in question. Think of the practices of attaching two flat objects by using a nail and a hammer, using nails and a hammer, henceforth hammering, or screws and a screwdriver, henceforth screwing. You can't say what hammering or screwing are without referring to the actual objects incorporated in them in different ways. The hammer, nails, and so on that play essential roles in those practices. This is a VV necessity relation concerning the vocabularies that are VP sufficient to specify this basic sort of practical transaction. In order to specify this kind of practice or ability, one must use vocabulary that picks out the objects they involve. That's the thickness. The next piece of the pragmatist approach to intentionality is the claim that the specifically semantic intentionality displayed in language use, engaging in discursive practices, deploying an autonomous vocabulary, should be understood both as a development of and a special case of the sort of basic practical intentionality exhibited already by these kinds of feedback-governed transactions that were mentioned in the first three theses. Now, we must ask what the relation is between understanding saying as a sort of doing, on the one hand, and understanding it as a representing, as establishing a semantic relation between subjective doings and objective states of affairs, between representings and representeds, on the other hand. It's only in terms of an answer to this question that we can give a definite sense to the final claim of the pragmatist line of thought that I've been sketching. That's the fifth one. One cannot understand the two poles of specifically semantic or discursive intentionality, knowing and acting subjects on the one hand, and the objects they know of or act on the other, their representing activities and the objects or objective states of affairs they represent, independently of the semantic intentional relations they stand into one another, and then somehow bolt together those ways of understanding the subject and object, the relata, to understand the relations between them. One must rather start with an understanding of the thick practices engaged in and abilities exercised, and abstract from or dissect out of that an understanding of the two poles of the semantic intentional relations those practices and abilities institute or establish. It's a commitment to this order of explanation that is, I think, most characteristic of the philosophical tradition I've been calling pragmatism. Well, how could the metavocabulary of meaning-use analysis that I've been developing for analyzing complex resultant meaning-use relations be applied to make more definite the Deweyan claim about the possibility of extracting an understanding of the relata of intentional and semantic relations from a conception of the practices that conditionally link sequences of perception and action in processes of transaction with an environment? The way I'm going to pursue here looks to our earlier discussion of the expressive roles characteristic of normative and modal vocabularies. I've made a number of claims about them over the course of these lectures. The most basic of these, introduced in the fourth lecture, was that each of these vocabularies should be seen as LX for, as elaborated from and explicitating of, various features essential to every autonomous discursive practice. The features of discursive practice from which the normative vocabulary of commitment and entitlement is elaborated, and which it makes explicit, are different from those which the modal vocabulary of necessity and possibility are elaborated and make explicit. But they are intimately related. What I want to claim now is that those features correspond, respectively, to the subjective and objective poles of intentional relations. Further, the relation between normative and modal vocabulary explored in my fifth lecture, in particular the way in which normative vocabulary can be understood to serve as a pragmatic metavocabulary for modal vocabulary, provides an important tool for understanding the relation between the use of expressions as representations and what they represent. The basic idea is that normative vocabulary makes explicit important features of what knowing and acting subjects do when they deploy a vocabulary, when they use expressions so as to say something. And modal vocabulary makes explicit important features both of what is said and of the objective world that's talked about. Put another way, normative and modal vocabulary, each in its own way, articulate commitments. But normative vocabulary addresses in the first instance acts of committing oneself, while modal vocabulary addresses in the first instance the contents one thereby commits oneself to. not in the sense of what other doings committing oneself to a claim commits one to, but in the sense of how one has committed oneself to the world being, how one has represented it as being. If there's anything to this idea, then thinking about complex, pragmatically mediated, resultant semantic relations between normative and modal vocabularies is a way of thinking analytically both about discursive intentionality, that is, the kind that involves distinctively semantic relations, and about the relation between what one who engages in a discursive practice does and what she says about the objective things she thereby represents or talks about. Now you'll find on your handout a meaning use diagram called Analyzing or Dissecting Discursive Practices into Subjective Normative and Objective Modal Components. In this meaning use diagram, the sub-practices of the autonomous discursive practice that are labeled subjective normative and objective modal are to be identified as those picked out by the dual conditions that they are the practices from which practices PV sufficient for the introduction of normative vocabulary, or respectively modal vocabulary, can be elaborated, and the practices which are made explicit by that vocabulary in the sense that it's VP sufficient to specify them. In this way, the complex resultant meaning-use relations they stand in are used to dissect out what then show up as components of autonomous discursive practices. How might we think about the aspects of discursive practices that are picked out in this way by the dual LXness conditions in terms of which the use of normative and modal vocabularies is analyzed? In the senses in which I've been using the terms, a creature's practical engagement with its world exhibits practical intentionality, insofar as it's feedback governed. That is, specifiable, in a suitably rich vocabulary, as having an algorithmic test-operate, test-exit structure, in which each cycle is mediated by its differential responses to the effect of its own performances. Specifying the behavior of a system in such terms is taking or treating it as practically directed towards the features of its environment that play a suitable dual role in the reliably covarying causal chains of events that serve both as inputs to and outputs from the system that engages in a process with this structure. Such a system counts as exhibiting discursive abilities or engaging in discursive practices, hence as exhibiting specifically discursive intentionality, insofar as the differential responsiveness of the system to the results of its own performances is essentially mediated by states whose functional role in the feedback process can be understood only by taking them to be propositionally contentful, that is, by specifying them in intentional vocabulary, paradigmatically as involving the claim, belief, preference, or intention that P, where P is a declarative sentence in the VP sufficient intentional vocabulary specifying the practices or abilities in question. I've been conducting this whole investigation within the scope of the assumption that a necessary element of that requirement is that the process that mediates between differential sensitivity to the effects of prior performances and differential dispositions to produce subsequent performances, between testing and operating in the tote cycle, be governed by and exhibit sensitivity to norms articulating relations of material incompatibility and material inference. Sensitivity to the applicability of such conceptual norms is manifested in the way the system updates its beliefs, preferences, and intentions, thereby moving from one functional state to another during the process of its engagement with its environment. At the beginning of Lecture 5, I pointed out how the deontic normative vocabulary of commitment and entitlement could be used to codify many of the different kinds of material inferential and incompatibility relations that structure these inferential processes, practices, or activities. The next question, then, is how this sort of directedness at objects, via feedback engagement with them, that's characteristic of practical intentionality, turns into something intelligible as representation of those objects when the process of practical engagement takes the form of deontic updating, structured by material inferential and incompatibility relations. That is, when it becomes discursive intentionality. Answering that question is beginning to work out the pragmatist's order of semantic explanation. And telling that story requires saying how, within the discursive realm, representational of intentionality is related to expressive that intentionality. That is, how what one is talking of or about, representing, is related to what one says of or about those things. And doing that will enable us to get clearer about the nature of the intimate relation between what it is about our practices of saying that's made explicit by normative vocabulary and what it is about what's said that's made explicit by modal vocabulary, which is my suggestion as to how to pursue the pragmatist explanatory aspiration, namely by describing a complex resultant meaning-use relation between those vocabularies that offers yet a further way, beyond those considered in lectures 4 and 5, of filling in and following out Seller's dark but suggestive remark that the language of modalities is a transposed language of norms. Consider a non-autonomous vocabulary, a language fragment, centered on the use of the term acid. In the toy practice I'm envisaging, if a liquid tastes sour, one is committed and entitled to apply the term acid to it. And if one is committed to calling something acid, then one is committed to its turning phenolphthalein blue. I imagine that the community using this term displays wide agreement under concurrent stimulation concerning what things are sour, what things are blue, and that it has experts certifying some vials as containing phenolphthalein. In using the term acid with these circumstances and consequences of application, the community is implicitly endorsing the propriety of a material inference from a liquid's tasting sour to its turning phenolphthalein blue. If a practitioner comes across a kind of liquid that tastes sour but turns phenolphthalein red, she finds herself with commitments that are materially incompatible by her own lights. For she infers from its sourness that it's an acid, and from its being an acid that the phenolphthalein solution to which it's added must be blue. But exercising her reliable differential responsive dispositions directly, she non-inferentially acquires an incompatible observational commitment to the phenolphthalein solution being red. She can't be entitled to both. Inferential expansion of one observation has led to a commitment incompatible with another. To repair that incompatibility, update her beliefs, she's obliged either to relinquish the claim that the liquid tastes sour, or relinquish the claim that the phenolphthalein solution is red, or revise her conception of an acid, so that it no longer mediates the inference that caused the problem, maybe by restricting its applicability to clear liquids that taste sour, or by restricting the consequences to turning phenolphthalein blue when the liquid is heated to its boiling point. Entitling oneself to any of these moves involves further commitments it may not be easy to entitle oneself to, and none of them may be ultimately successful. But in any case, something has been learned. This little parable of one cycle of practical operating and testing involves discursive updating of at least 3 basic types: expanding one's observations by drawing commitment and entitlement preserving inferential conclusions, registering any resulting materially incompatible commitments, and repairing them by modifying or relinquishing some of those commitments or the concepts that link them inferentially. Those inferential links between observational concepts, whose applicability can also be elicited non-inferentially by the exercise of reliable differential responsive dispositions, engender the possibility of friction between the world and the deployment of vocabulary in a practical cycle of perception and performance articulated by those material inferential and incompatibility relations. In the context of the set of practices and abilities I described, the world, by presenting a liquid that tastes sour and turns phenolphthalein red, is telling our imaginary community that it cannot have the concept acid with the original circumstances and consequences of application. For what's been revealed is that, contrary to the material inference curled up in that concept, it's not necessary that sour liquids turn phenolphthalein blue. It is possible that a liquid be both sour and turn phenolphthalein red. When enough tote cycles of this sort have been engaged in to produce a relatively stable and successful discursive practice, objective facts about what actually follows from and is incompatible with what will have been incorporated in the material inferences and incompatibilities that articulate the concepts expressed by the vocabulary deployed according to the practical norms implicit in that practice. This essentially holistic process involves getting on to how things objectively are, not just by making true claims, but also by coming to acknowledge the right concepts. We see here in microcosm a pivotal relation between what's expressed by the use of normative vocabulary to codify central features of the inferentially articulated doings of knowing and acting discursive subjects, and what's expressed by the use of modal vocabulary to characterize central features of the objective world they talk about and act in, its laws, what connections are necessary, what's really possible. When all goes well, the normative structure of consequential commitments and entitlements, including incompatibilities, tracks the modal structure of laws relating possible facts. Taking an inference to be a good one, even in counterfactual circumstances, by endorsing an appropriate strict conditional, is what one needs to do in order to say that a law holds objectively. And an essential part of what one is doing in committing oneself, whether doxastically or practically, to some claimable content, is taking responsibility for integrating it into a whole constellation of such commitments by following out its inferential consequences in the context of its fellows and subjecting it to rational criticism by confronting it with any concomitant commitments that turn out to be materially incompatible with it. Engaging in that fundamental sort of discursive activity is what Kant calls synthesizing a transcendental unity of apperception. Apperception is discursive, that is, conceptually articulated awareness, undertaking commitments whose contents can be specified by sentences. The unity of those discursive commitments is a normative unity, a matter of taking responsibility for one's commitments by acknowledging what else they commit and entitle one to, and what other commitments to which one may initially be committed they preclude entitlement to. Discursive updating aims at the material inferential completeness and compatibility of one's commitments in the normative sense, that insofar as one falls short of those ideals, one is normatively obliged to do something about it, to repair the failure. The point I want to focus on, however, is that the account of feedback loops of perception and performance, normatively governed by relations of material inference and incompatibility, is a pragmatic version of Kant's account of synthesizing a transcendental unity of apperception. In his terminology, transcendental logic is distinguished from general logic by its concern with content rather than just the forms of judgments. And that content is understood in terms of representation of objects. Now, I've urged that an essential element of the propositional contentfulness expressed by declarative sentences and attributed by that clauses in ascriptions of intentional states using vocabulary such as claims that and believes that, consists in those contents standing in material inferential and incompatibility relations to one another. And these are the very relations that normatively govern the discursive updating process that I've lined up with Kant's notion of synthesizing a transcendental unity of apperception. But what, we may ask, makes the unity in question deserve to be called transcendental, in a sense that invokes representation of objects? The answer, I think, lies in the way in which acknowledging material inferential and incompatibility relations essentially involves representing objects as having properties, perhaps complex relational ones, that stand in corresponding relations to one another. In drawing inferences and, as we may say, repelling incompatibilities, one is taking oneself to stand in representational relations to objects that one in that sense counts as talking about. Here's how I think this works. A commitment to A's being a dog does not entail commitment to B's being a mammal, but it does entail a commitment to A's being a mammal. So drawing the inference from a dog judgment to a mammal judgment is taking it that the two judgments represent one and the same object. Again, the judgment that A is a dog is not incompatible with the judgment that B is a fox. It is incompatible with the judgment that A is a fox. So taking a dog judgment to be incompatible with a fox judgment is taking them to refer to or represent an object, the one object to which incompatible properties are being attributed by the two claims. Representational purport is accordingly an integral feature of the process of practically acknowledging material inferential and incompatibility relations that is discursive updating. It involves a kind of triangulation on the object represented that's evidently the discursive, theoretical culmination of a progression that begins with the way physical objects are incorporated in feedback-governed practical engagements with things. The most basic sort of practical triangulation on objects happens when the results of one responsive performance are themselves the stimulus eliciting a further response, as for instance with the nail one hits with the hammer, perceives the effect on, and then responds to anew by hitting it again until it's driven flush. The next level of triangulation includes both the practical exercise of reliable differential responsive dispositions and relations of material inference and incompatibility, and depends on their interaction. It might be epitomized by the way the one liquid observed both to taste sour and turn phenolphthalein red is caught up in the toy practice of using the term acid that I sketched a minute ago. The next level might dispense with the immediate involvement of practical responsiveness entirely, as in the purely inferential and incompatibility relations among the concepts dog, mammal, and fox. These forms of triangulation begin with purely practical incorporation of something objective in a feedback-governed process, and end with purely theoretical objective representational purport. The triangulation that consists in acknowledging material incompatibilities and inferences is, in a nutshell, how the normative demand for a rational unity of apperception in judgments makes intelligible representational purport, what it is to take or treat judgments in practice as representing or being about objects. Together, the different stages in the progression illustrate both how discursive intentionality is rooted in and grows out of practical intentionality, and how within the discursive realm, representational or of intentionality is inseparably related to expressive or that intentionality. Expanding commitments inferentially, noting and repairing incompatibilities, the ampliative and critical dimensions, the inhalation and exhalation of living discursive activity, is synthesizing a normative, rational unity of apperception. For it's treating one's commitments as reasons for and against other commitments. And we see how doing that is the endless production and reproduction, at once practical and ideal, of a unity, a holistic rational system of commitments that's transcendental in Kant's sense, in that it's the process that institutes representational relations. Acknowledging the rational critical responsibility implicit in taking incompatible commitments to oblige one to do something, to update one's commitment so as to eliminate the incompatibility, is exactly what one must do in order in practice to be taking oneself to be talking about or representing things, in the normative sense of making oneself responsible to them for the correctness of one's claims and the success of one's actions. Discursive intentionality of both sorts, that intentionality and of intentionality, indeed, as we can now say, discursive intentionality along both of its inextricably intertwined expressive and representational dimensions, is the paradigmatic semantic phenomenon. I've been rehearsing some of the ways in which it can be seen to be a pragmatically mediated semantic phenomenon, by looking at some of the things one must do, the practices one must engage in, the abilities one must exercise, in order to say of something that it is thus and so. Of course, in some sense, no one ever doubted the general semantic pragmatist's claim. What else but the way it's used could make a vocabulary mean or represent something? But the analytic pragmatist is interested in saying in detail, in other VP sufficient terms, what one must do, what is PV sufficient, to count thereby as saying or representing something. And the claim that one cannot understand what semantic relations are except by understanding the practical processes by which they're instituted, a sort of pragmatic sense dependence claim, has not always been thought to be a truism or even to be true. Now, the most surprising claim I've made here is that a special insight into the nature of semantic intentional relations and their relation to the discursive practices of rational amplification and rectification, normatively governed, respectively, by material inferential and incompatibility relations that establish and maintain them, that a special insight into that can be gleaned by looking at complex resultant pragmatically mediated meaning use relations between normative and modal vocabularies. As we've seen, this claim is the final move in a way of working out the pragmatist order of semantic explanation, which we can think of as involving 4 sequential steps. First is the idea that the most basic form of intentionality is feedback-governed practical transactions, things that exhibit the structure of tote cycles of differential response and response to the effects of that response. To understand a process as having this structure is to take it to be algorithmically decomposable, that is, specifiable as the algorithmic elaboration of more basic differential responsive capacities, a special kind of PP sufficiency relation. To do that is to specify it in terms of some more basic abilities and the way algorithmic elaborative capacities are deployed to implement the more complex ability. That's a special kind of VP sufficiency relation. This is all a very basic kind of functionalism, functionalism about practical intentionality, which we've seen to be integral to the pragmatist version of the program of artificial intelligence. The second move is to understand specifically discursive intentionality, the kind that institutes semantic relations, as a species of such feedback-governed practical engagement in which performance and response are mediated by relations of material inference and incompatibility. The third stage in this progression is then the claim that instead of thinking of the intentional nexus to begin with in terms of relations of a distinctive kind, semantic, between things that we can in principle characterize antecedently to and independently of their semantic relation, subjects and objects, representeds and representings, or as Fodor likes to put it, horses and horses, we think rather of two dimensions abstracted from or brought into relief within such a feedback-governed process of practical engagement, mediated by discursive relations of material incompatibility and inference. It's this line of thought that then is supposed to be completed by appeal to, fourth, features of such discursive practices that are made explicit by the normative and modal vocabularies that can be elaborated from those practices. To fill in this last idea, I want to focus on the notion of material incompatibility that I've argued is implicit in discursive practice and can be made explicit both in alethic modal terms and in deontic normative terms. As I've been telling this story, developing the meaning-use analytic pragmatist approach to semantics requires appeal to two different senses of incompatibility, which turn out to be related in a surprising and revealing way. One is an objective modal sense, a matter of what states and affairs and properties of objects actually are incompatible with what others, in the world as it is, independent of the attitudes of knowing and acting subjects of practical feedback-governed transactional engagements. If being made of pure copper is in this sense objectively incompatible with being an electrical insulator, then nothing can be both at the same time. It's impossible for one and the same object simultaneously to have both properties. Impossible. Modal notion. That's a fact that holds regardless of how we use the words copper and insulator. Indeed, it was a fact before there were any deployers of vocabulary at all. When in my previous lecture I showed how the concept of incompatibility could be used as the basis of a formal semantics, capturing important features of the meanings of linguistic expressions, both logical and non-logical, this is the sense of incompatibility that semantic metavocabulary employed. The other sense of incompatible is normative and concerns commitments on the part of knowing and acting subjects, the ones who engage in discursive practices and exercise discursive abilities. To say that two commitments, whether doxastic or practical, are incompatible in this sense is to say that one cannot be entitled to both, so that if one finds oneself with such commitments, one is obliged to do something to rectify or repair the incompatibility by relinquishing or modifying at least one of the commitments, to enter into a process of updating, of rectification, of further synthesizing of a rational unity. What's incompatible with what, in this sense, is a matter of the practices and attitudes of the subjects of those commitments, of the norms implicit in their behavior, what they in practice take or treat as incompatible in acknowledging and attributing the deontic statuses of commitment and entitlement. Now, the first point I want to emphasize is that these are clearly different notions of incompatibility. It's impossible for one and the same object to have incompatible properties at the same time. But it's merely impermissible for one and the same subject to have incompatible commitments at the same time. We can undertake such commitments. It's not impossible to do so. Indeed, we do it all the time, albeit usually involuntarily. And when we do, the consequence is a change in normative status, we're not entitled to the incompatible commitments, and so we're obliged to do something to rectify the situation. But we may not actually do it. We may not actually do what in this normative sense is demanded of us, or even practically be able to do it. We're discursively born into a state of sin, and for all our conscientious efforts are by and large doomed to live in such a state. If P and Q are incompatible in the alethic modal sense, then it's necessary that not P and Q. But if P and Q are incompatible in the normative deontic sense, then it's indeed required that one not be committed to P and Q in the sense that one ought not to be, but it does not at all follow that one is in fact not so committed. The sort of looseness of fit between what's necessary or required in the deontic normative sense and what's actual is not even intelligible in the alethic modal sense of necessity. It's worth noticing that these two senses of incompatible are interdefinable with the two poles of the intentional nexus, knowing and acting subjects and the objects towards which their cognitive and practical states are directed. For, suppressing for the moment the relativity to times, objects are individuated by the way they repel incompatible properties. It's not impossible for two different objects to have incompatible properties, say being copper and electrically insulating. What is impossible is for one and the same object to do so. Objects, then, play the conceptual functional role of units of account for alethic modal incompatibilities. A single object just is what cannot have incompatible properties at the same time. That is, it's an essential individuating feature of the metaphysical, categorical sortal metaconcept, object, that objects have the metaproperty of modally repelling incompatibilities. And in a parallel fashion, subjects too are individuated by the way they normatively repel incompatible commitments. It's not impermissible for two different subjects to have incompatible commitments. Say, for me to take the coin to be copper and you to take it to be an electrical insulator. What is impermissible is for one and the same subject to do so. So, subjects play the conceptual functional role of a unit of account for deontic normative incompatibilities. That is, it's an essential individuating feature of the metaphysical, categorical, sortal metaconcept, subject, that subjects have the metaproperty of normatively repelling incompatibilities. A single subject is just what ought not to have incompatible commitments at the same time. These considerations show, I think, that although, as I've emphasized, the alethic and deontic senses of incompatible are quite different, they're intimately related to one another. We're not, for instance, faced with a term that's just ambiguous. The two uses of the word incompatible are not mere homonyms. Further, the relation between incompatibility in the normative sense and incompatibility in the modal sense is an expression of deep structural features of the nexus of intentionality, the nature of its subjective and objective poles, and of the relation between them. What relates the two senses is a process, a practice, the exercise of an ability, a kind of practical doing, what discursive subjects are obliged to do when they find themselves acknowledging incompatible commitments, perhaps, as in the story about acid, some acquired inferentially and some acquired non-inferentially. What one is obliged to do is to rectify the incoherent commitments by relinquishing one of the offending commitments, or, as in that example, modifying a mediating inferential commitment, and hence a concept. This is repelling incompatibilities in the normative sense. That objects repel incompatibilities in the modal sense is simply a fact metaphysically constitutive of objects as such. But subjects' repelling of incompatibilities is a process, an activity, a practice, the exercise of an ability. It's something they actively do. That they are obliged to do it is a fact metaphysically constitutive of subjects as such. Here's the key point. By doing that, by engaging in the practice of rectifying commitments, subjects are at once both taking or treating the commitments involved as incompatible in the normative sense of obliging them to do something about that collision, and taking or treating two states of affairs regarding objects as incompatible in the modal sense, that it's impossible for both to obtain. These are, I repeat, quite different senses of incompatible. But in practically acknowledging an obligation to rectify or repair a set of commitments, one is doing something that can be specified not just by using one or the other of these senses of incompatibility, but crucially something one can specify by using both. That it can be specified in both ways, both in normative terms and in modal terms, is what it is for the vocabulary whose use is being rectified to have semantic intentional content, for its deployment to count as representing objects and saying of them that they are objectively thus and so. The basic phenomenon that underlies the complex meaning-use relation detailed in the diagram I presented earlier is accordingly a substructure of this one. And here on your handout you have rational rectification. Treating commitments as normatively incompatible is treating properties as modally incompatible. Engaging in the practice of rectifying one's commitments is entering into a tote cycle whose exit condition is the removal of a local material incoherence in one's commitments, cognitive or practical. Practically acknowledging a commitment to that in some particular case is treating the commitments involved as discordant, both in the sense that they're normatively incompatible for a subject and in the sense that they involve attributing modally incompatible properties to an object. We already saw that treating two claims as incompatible is taking them to refer to one and the same object. We're now in a position to see this fact as an aspect of a more general one. Shouldering the responsibility of repair and rectification of incompatible commitments is what one has to do in order to be taking one's claims to be about an objective world, in the normative sense of granting that world authority over the correctness of one's claims. In treating two commitments as incompatible in the sense of normatively requiring giving up at least one of them, or otherwise modifying them so as to render them materially compatible, one is treating them both as claims about objects, and about at least some of the same objects, and as incorrect about those objects because they attribute to them modally incompatible properties. That's what subjects must do in order thereby to be treating the vocabulary they deploy in acknowledging the commitments in question as expressing objective contents, claims about the properties, usually complex relational properties, of objects. What we might think of as an objectivist semantic order of explanation begins with the way the world objectively is, construed here as a matter of what really follows from what, and what's really incompatible with what, in the alethic modal sense. This conception is then taken to define the goal of inquiry, which accordingly determines a norm for the process of commitment revision, according to an instrumental model. One ought to revise one's commitments so as more closely to approach the goal of practically taking commitments to stand in material incompatibility or consequence relations, just in case the states of affairs and properties they represent objectively do stand in such relations to one another. That's what the subject is obliged, as a knower and an agent, to try to do. That ideal consilience of subjective normative attitude and practice, on the one hand, and objective modal fact, on the other, sets the standard for assessing the process of commitment revision. It is the image of language triumphant that process draws within language militant, as Sellers puts it. That never-reached but always efficacious functional ideal is inscribed within the essentially discursive practice of rectification and amplification by being an exit condition of a practical test-operate test-exit cycle that's mediated by relations of material incompatibility and consequence. That's the objectivist order of semantic explanation. A complementary order of semantic explanation, by contrast, begins with what discursive practitioners actually do. That is, with the practical discursive process of rectifying and amplifying their commitments. It seeks to make the notion of objective modal relations intelligible in terms of this process. We've seen how normative talk of commitment and entitlement, and of the sort of incompatibility of commitments definable in terms of them, can serve as a pragmatic metavocabulary, saying what subjects must do in order to be taking or treating two properties as objectively incompatible in the full-blooded modal sense that can then be understood as providing a second-order norm for assessing normative relations among commitments and entitlements. For that representational semantic normativity is implicit in the fact that rectifying one's commitments so as to eliminate acknowledged incompatibilities among them is at once both treating two commitments as incompatible in the normative sense of obliging subjects to do something, and treating two properties as incompatible in the objective modal sense. So, in the most general terms, the objectivist order of semantic explanation proceeds from objective modal relations via semantic normativity to subjective normativity. And a complementary order of semantic explanation, what I'll call subjective pragmatism, proceeds from the subjective normativity displayed in the practical activity of amplifying and rectifying acknowledged commitments, and seeks to understand both objective modal relations and the semantic normativity linking them to subjective normativity in terms of that activity. Now, the view I want to recommend is inspired by the insights of what I've called subjective pragmatism. But as the symmetry of the meaning-use diagrams that I've presented as expressing the complex resultant meaning-use relations between alethic modal and deontic normative vocabulary indicates, it rejects its one-sidedness in favor of a more even-handed understanding. Rather than turning the objectivist order of explanation on its head, what I want to call objective pragmatism about intentionality sees those features of discursive practice that are made explicit by modal vocabulary and those that are made explicit by normative vocabulary as complementary, as each in principle fully intelligible only in terms of its relation to the other. Its understanding is, as the slogan that forms the title of this lecture has it, that discursive intentionality is a pragmatically mediated semantic relation, one that essentially involves both what one is doing in saying something and what is said about how it is with what one is thereby talking about. Well, in this lecture, I've principally been concerned to show how the practical activity of rectifying commitments by removing incompatibilities provides a perspective from which deontic normative and alethic modal vocabulary show up as two sides of one coin, as making explicit essentially complementary aspects of what then becomes visible as an intentional nexus, semantically connecting knowing and acting subjects with the objects they know about and act on. This is the activity that pragmatically mediates the semantic relations characteristic of discursive intentionality. There's obviously a great deal more that could be said about the relations between the complementarity of these uses of normative and modal vocabulary and semantic intentionality. My purpose here has only been to open up the topic in such a way as both to give some definiteness to the suggestion that discursive intentionality itself should be thought of as a pragmatically mediated semantic relation, to show how that relation can be understood as instituted by the pragmatic process of rectifying and amplifying commitments, and so to indicate some of the ways in which it may prove fruitful to think of intentionality in terms of the analytic pragmatism that animates it and is expressed in meaning-use analysis. Well, as I said at the end of my first lecture, I took the overall title for this lecture series from the Italian proverb, "Between saying and doing, many a pair of shoes is worn out." I want to close with a brief reminder of some of the shoes I've been wearing out, perhaps along with your patience. I began with a picture of 20th century philosophical analysis that presents it as a tradition unified by a distinctive semantic project, systematically to explore different kinds of logical relations between the meanings expressed by different kinds of vocabularies. It's this semantic logicism that I see as distinguishing the various 20th century versions, for instance, of the programs of empiricism and naturalism, from their Enlightenment predecessors, and is making possible a third characteristic core program of analysis, functionalism in the philosophy of mind. My concerns in these lectures have been framed by the confrontation between this analytic semantic tradition and a kind of radical pragmatism, epitomized by, but by no means restricted to, the later Wittgenstein. A pragmatism which sees theories of meaning as in principle bad ways of thinking about the uses of linguistic expressions, as resulting from intellectualist or scientistic misconceptions concerning the nature of discursive understanding. In its strongest form, the pragmatist challenge rejects the very possibility of general systematic semantic analysis, leaving room only for a kind of local therapeutic pragmatics, diagnosis and treatment of misunderstandings of features of the use of particular expressions that are the residue of uncritical theoretical philosophical commitments. But, I urged, we need not choose between analyzing meanings and describing use. I've offered two suggestions as to how the insights of these two traditions can be synthesized. One consists in showing how the vocabulary of automaton theory can be generalized so as to serve as a tool for analyzing practices or abilities by specifying some of them as algorithmically decomposable into others, from which they can be algorithmically elaborated. I made two principal claims concerning this sort of purely pragmatic formal analysis. The first is that the fact that, as I claim, practices sufficient to deploy logical vocabulary can in this sense be algorithmically elaborated from practices necessary for the deployment of any autonomous vocabulary. That vindicates in a novel way the privileged position that logical vocabulary is accorded in the classical project of philosophical analysis. The second is that the pragmatic core of the artificial intelligence version of the program of functionalism should be understood to consist not in a thesis about the ultimately symbolic nature of sapience, but rather in the claim that autonomous discursive practices can be algorithmically elaborated from practices or abilities, each of which can be engaged in or exhibited by non-discursive creatures. Of course, I argued that that wasn't true, but that's the right version of the claim. Besides this kind of purely pragmatic analysis of doings, I introduced the idea of a kind of analysis of the relations between saying and doing, what I called meaning-use analysis. This is a way of representing and articulating the relations between meaningful vocabularies. Along the way, I've discussed logical, indexical, observational, modal, normative, and intentional vocabularies. The relations between meaningful vocabularies and the practices or abilities of deploying them that constitute the use in virtue of which they mean what they do. To the sort of practical PP sufficiency of one set of practices or abilities for another that obtains when one set can be algorithmically elaborated into another, meaning-use analysis adds two other important basic meaning-use relations: the PV sufficiency of a set of practices or abilities to deploy a vocabulary, and the VP sufficiency of a vocabulary to specify some set of practices or abilities. Composing those basic meaning-use relations allows us to exhibit more complex relations among vocabularies and practices, meanings and uses, as resultants of constellations of the basic ones. One simple but important example is the relation of one vocabulary being a pragmatic metavocabulary for another. It holds when one vocabulary is VP sufficient to specify practices or abilities that are in turn PV sufficient to deploy another vocabulary. This is the simplest kind of pragmatically mediated semantic relation. It can happen, we saw, that the expressive power of a pragmatic metavocabulary may differ substantially from that of the vocabulary it lets us say what we must do in order to deploy. This is the phenomenon I called pragmatic expressive bootstrapping. For instance, we saw that it can be proven that automata PV sufficient to deploy all recursively enumerable vocabularies can be specified already in context-free vocabularies. And I argued that a non-indexical pragmatic metavocabulary can be VP sufficient to specify practices PV sufficient to deploy an indexical vocabulary. In those two cases, the pragmatic metavocabulary is strictly expressively weaker than its target vocabulary. But sometimes the two simply have different sorts of expressive power. The big theme of the second part of my lectures, the last three, has been the relations between modal and normative vocabularies, and of both to the autonomous discursive practices we attribute by the use of intentional vocabulary. In this connection, I made 5 large claims. First, I argued that a suitably chosen normative deontic vocabulary of commitment and entitlement can serve as a sufficient pragmatic metavocabulary for a lethic modal vocabulary. That is, we can explain what one must do in order to be deploying the objective modal notion of incompatibility in terms of the normative notion of claimings that are incompatible, just in case commitment to one rules out entitlement to the other. Second, I showed how the notion of incompatibility, introduced that way, can be used as the basis of a semantic metavocabulary, in terms of which we can define both logical and modal operators, and also represent important aspects of the contents even of non-logical concepts. Third, I argued for what I called the Kant-Sellers theses, which constitute the first half of the complex resultant expressive property of vocabularies that I called LXness. As is the case with logical vocabulary, practices or abilities PV sufficient to deploy both modal and normative vocabulary can be algorithmically elaborated from practices PV necessary for deploying any autonomous vocabulary. Fourth, what's the other half of the LXness of these vocabularies? I pointed out that normative and modal vocabularies each make explicit, a matter of the VP sufficiency of a vocabulary to specify practices or abilities, important aspects implicit in the use of any autonomous vocabulary, that is, that are PV necessary for it. Finally, as we've just seen, those complementary aspects made explicit by normative and modal vocabulary correspond to the subjective and objective poles of the intentional nexus between what discursive practitioners do, their activity of claiming, and the object's properties and facts that they thereby count as saying something about. This shows what's required for practical intentionality to develop into discursive intentionality. And it exhibits discursive intentionality as a particular kind of pragmatically mediated semantic relation. I'm going to close with a dark, but I hope intriguing suggestion. I think the views that Hegel is trying to express with his notorious assertion of the identity of subject and substance is that conceptually, the normative sense of material incompatibility, his determinate negation, that applies to subjective commitments, and the modal sense of material incompatibility that articulates the objective facts and properties are two sides of one coin, each intelligible only in terms of the other, because the activity of taking or treating two commitments to be incompatible in the subjective normative sense just is what it is to take or treat properties or states of affairs as incompatible in the objective modal sense. I think this pragmatically mediated semantic relation, which has nothing to do with any claim about the causal dependence of how things are on how anyone takes them to be, is the essence of the view that he develops under the heading of idealism. But that's a story for quite another occasion. Thank you.
We'll get started. As usual, we'll begin the second part of the session with the formal comments, this time from Sebastian Riddle of the University of Basel, and then we'll move to the open discussion.
Thank you. It's a great honor to speak here. I wish to follow Yada's example, who said that since his encounter with Bob Brandom, he has not been the same philosopher he was before. That is true of me. When in '98 I came to Pittsburgh upon Brandom's invitation as a postdoctoral student, I was overwhelmed by his intellectual generosity. And one manifestation of his generosity was that when I thought something was wrong in his theory, he urged me on. I could not be more grateful for such teaching, but you may think he has gone too far. Brandom suggests, and this is the fourth of a sequence of claims he propounds in Lecture 6, that we understand language and thought as, I quote, a development of and a special case of the sort of basic practical intentionality exhibited by the kind of feedback-governed transactions mentioned in the first three theses. These transactions are tote cycles, test, operate, test, exit, that link dispositions to respond in certain ways to certain kinds of stimulus in such a way that the effect of a given response is the next stimulus. I quote again, a creature's practical engagement with its world exhibits practical intentionality insofar as it is feedback governed, that is, specifiable as having an algorithmic tote structure in which each cycle is mediated by its differential responses to the effects of its own performances. I think behavior does not manifest intentionality of any kind on account of exhibiting this structure. So I argue in the first part of my presentation. It follows that the unity of normative and modal thought to which Brandom attracts our attention does not, as he claims, explain the objective validity of thought or judgment. In the second part, I argue that the unity of normative and modal thought does not explain objective validity, but is explained by it. A toad cycle is a sequence of acts of abilities. An ability is a stimulus-response pair, something that has the ability responds in a certain way to stimuli of a certain kind. When something does X to it, stimulus, it does Y in consequence, response. In their ordinary use, the terms stimulus and response apply only to animals. Comprehension of them presupposes a theory of the animal. But Brandom uses the words in the austere way I explained. So he can speak of automata as responding to stimuli. In the present context, then, we do not deploy the concept of intentional action or animal movement when we say that something does something and does it in consequence of being affected in a certain way. Do is a variable verb, and the schema, something acts on something which does such and such in consequence, that schema does not restrict its instances, the instances of do in it, to verbs representing animal movement. The flame heats the water, which boils in consequence. The water, suffering the stimulus of the heat, responds by boiling. We may think the following a prime example of a response to a stimulus. I clap my hands, and the cat shies away, hiding under the sofa. The following is just as good an example. I throw the cat into the fire, and she burns to ashes. The fire acts on the cat, providing a stimulus to which she responds by burning. This shows that the idea of a responsive disposition does not help us understand the intentionality animals exhibit in, I quote, dealing skillfully with the world. It is not true that, I quote again, the most basic form of such activity, dealing skillfully with the world, is a toad cycle of perception, performance, assessment of results of performance, and further performance. End of quote. A toad cycle is, I quote again, an algorithmic elaboration of responsive dispositions, Brandom says. There's a stimulus, test, and a response, operate. The effect of the response is the next stimulus, test, to which there's a further response, operate, and so on, until there's no further response, exit. But we must not be misled by the word perception when Brandom speaks of a toad cycle of perception, performance, and so on. Perception signifies a form of intentionality. But just as above, do did not mean animal movement, but any change. Here, perception means any case of something's being affected by something. Now, the cat burning in the fire does not exhibit intentionality, not by burning. She does not skillfully deal with the world as she burns. So the following is no account of animal intentionality. Something exhibits intentionality in doing something in consequence of being acted upon by something else. But nothing changes if we require that there be a sequence. Stimulus, response, further stimulus, further response, and so on. And nothing changes if later stimuli are previous responses. And nothing changes if at a certain point there is no longer any response, exit. What is algorithmically elaborated from responsive dispositions is a responsive disposition. If we do not find intentionality in the disposition to do a certain thing when acted upon in a certain way, then no amount of algorithmic elaboration will change that. Toad cycles have nothing to do with intentionality, nor would anyone think they did. Did he not imagining a toad cycle, an animal or a man skillfully dealing with the world? And this is how it must be with Brandom when he describes building a house as a toad cycle. So how is it when an animal or a man skillfully deals with the world? Consider this. I want to kill a man. I see him. Stimulus. Shoot him in the chest. Response. Walk up and look and see he is still moving. Next stimulus, effect of my response to the previous stimulus. I shoot again. Response. See that he is moving no more. Stimulus, effect of my response to the previous stimulus. And walk away. Exit. Here, there is not just a sequence of stimulus and response. And not only is the effect of a given response the next stimulus, the responses are united as means to an end that I represent. They are united as steps I take to kill the man. This unity is constituted by my representing it, by my deriving the steps from it, which explains the exit. I see I've reached my end. The man is dead. My killing the man exhibits a teleological structure that is constituted by my representation of this very structure. Call this rational teleology. Here, the stimuli are not the ultimate causes of my responses, which therefore it is misleading to call responses. A stimulus, I see the man still moving, lets me shoot again because I'm inside this process, killing the man. Therefore, the process cannot be explained as a sequence of stimulus and response. On the contrary, the process is the principle of the sequence. While the process does exhibit intentionality, in the given case it exhibits not only sentience but sapience, it is an act of applying a concept in such a way as to realize an instance of it, its intentionality cannot be understood in terms of the Toad cycle. The cycle, its unity, must be understood through it. A Toad cycle may be governed by the practical application of a concept. It may also be governed by the natural teleology of vital processes. In the philosophy of biology, it is sometimes thought that one is left teleological explanation behind when one can describe the mechanisms by which a plant or organ does this or that. But describing a mechanism is describing a teleological process. Its end is the principle of unity of its steps, and only through the end, through what it is a mechanism for, is a mechanism apprehended. There's a more specific form of natural teleology that is the source of the concept of perception, and it too may subsume Toad cycles. A chimpanzee fishing for termites sticks the stick in the moon, gets it out, sees termites, licks them off, and so on. The unity of this sequence is the teleological process of extracting termites. The process is not explained by the Toad cycle. The Toad cycle, its unity, is explained by it. If we want to understand natural teleology in general, the special form of it signified by the concept of sentience, and the rational teleology signified by the concept of the will, then Brandom cannot help us because he thinks he has explained teleology, directedness, intentionality in terms of Toad cycles. The basic concept of Brandom's account of intentionality is the concept of a responsive disposition, a disposition to do such and such when being acted upon in such and such a way. In lectures 2 and 3, he anticipates that, I quote, the stimulus-response model might seem to impose a formal, narrowly behaviorist straitjacket on what counts as a primitive ability, which one might then think to precludes it from throwing light on language and thought. Now, Brandom thinks he can lay this worry to rest by observing that the model does not restrict the terms in which the stimulus and the response are described. For example, these are Brandom's examples, the stimulus may be lyrical poetry, and the response painting a well-composed picture. The disposition to respond to the presentation of a poem with painting a well-composed picture is one that presumably only sapient creatures could exhibit. Brandom envisages other responsive dispositions that, I quote, only a sentient creature could exhibit, end of quote. These passages, I think, reveal the fundamental flaw of Brandom's approach. The idea of a responsive disposition signifies a certain kind of unity of what affects something and what it does. If we call the unity the form, then the terms of the unity, the stimulus and the response, are the content. So Brandom thinks that any being, inanimate, living, sentient, sapient, is the subject of responsive dispositions. There may be differences in the kind of stimulus to which certain beings can respond, and in the kind of responses that can come from them. Sentience and sapience signify special terms of responsive dispositions, that is, special contents. Brandom does not consider the possibility that sentience and sapience signify different forms, that is, different kinds of unity of what affects something and what it does. But this is precisely what these terms signify. In a teleological process, the nexus of action and affection depends on the principle of the process, which therefore, on its part, cannot result from affection and be the act of a responsive disposition. I do not shoot whenever I see a man moving. I do so when killing the man is what I'm doing. Then his moving shows me that I have not yet killed him and need to shoot again. What's true of my shooting again holds of my killing the man. Its ultimate cause will not be a stimulus to which I respond. Action and affection bear a different kind of unity when the action is a vital operation, an animal movement, or an intentional action. Within this form of unity, we can distinguish natural teleology or life, sentient teleology or the animal, rational teleology or thought. And these are not ever more complex constellations of responsive dispositions, but different kinds of unity of action and affection. Brandom wants to illuminate objective validity through an inner nexus of normative and modal vocabulary. I think his idea can be presented as follows. Brandom's incompatibility semantics does not associate sentences with something other than sentences. It represents the meanings of sentences as other sentences or sets of them. Hence, we may doubt whether sentences, in virtue of being meaningful in the way represented by this incompatibility semantics, represent an object. A possible answer would be this. Think what it means that sentences are incompatible. It means they cannot be true together. It means not all of them can agree with the object. Incompatibility is a relation between sentences, but they bear this relation to each other in virtue of the relation they bear to the object. Now, this is not Brandom's answer. He finds it important, he stresses, that he can treat the concept of incompatibility as a semantic primitive and need not explain it in terms of truth. He can do this, he thinks, because he can give a pragmatic account of it and explain what it is to treat sentences as incompatible. It is to treat commitment to one as precluding entitlement to the other. Of course, here we need to require that the concepts of commitment and entitlement in turn be intelligible independently of the concept of truth or agreement with the object. So we are not to rely on the idea of relating to the object in judgment when we describe sentences as incompatible. Rather, Brandom argues we receive this idea from this description. Since we did not already invest it, this counts as explanation. Now we receive it in this way. Consider a vocabulary of sentences joined by inferential and incompatibility relations. We can say how sentences must be used to be such a vocabulary. Their use must involve suitable consequential relations of commitments and entitlements, or lack of entitlements. We can show that the ability to use such a vocabulary can be developed into an ability to use normative vocabulary and modal vocabulary, which in different ways describe or specify the very ability from which they are developed. Now, normative vocabulary expresses the idea of a subject of commitments, and modal vocabulary expresses the idea of an object to which her commitments are responsible. So, with normative and modal vocabulary, we possess the idea of a subject representing an object. But modal and normative vocabulary are, in a certain sense, contained in any vocabulary of sentences standing in inferential and incompatibility relations, and that is, in any vocabulary that, according to a leading assumption of the inquiry, is used to say anything at all. Moreover, we said modal and normative vocabulary describe the use of the vocabulary in which they are contained. If we allow ourselves to be lyrical, we can say any vocabulary using which is saying something describes itself as a practice of subjects representing objects. The form of my objection to this claim will be clear from the foregoing. I don't think it is possible to describe the use of language by the formal concept of a responsive disposition. Responsive dispositions do not constitute intentionality of any kind. The burning cat shows this. Joining dispositions to states and states to dynamic systems does not change this. We cannot comprehend vital processes through the concept of responsive dispositions, much less animal movement or action or language. These acts are distinguished not by the complexity of the responsive dispositions from which they spring, but by the different kind of unity of action and affection that they exhibit. The highest form of unity is this: something affects a subject who, being so affected, represents it in a judgment. A judgment is and is understood by its subject to be valid of its object. So we may call this sort of unity objective validity. Objective validity is not, I think, to be understood through responsive dispositions. A judgment is not a response to a stimulus. It bears a different relation to affection. If this is right, then no light is thrown on objective validity by the unity of normative and modal language if language is described in terms of responsive dispositions. Comprehension of normative and modal language and their unity must begin from objective validity as a different kind of unity of what affects something and what it does. In what follows, I argue that Brandom's failure to realize that his topic is a unity of action and affection different from the unity of stimulus and response corrupts his account of logical vocabulary. Then I sketch how, according to Kant, whom Brandom wishes to follow, the unity of modal and normative thought does not ground, but is grounded in, the objective validity of judgment. But before I do these two things, I want to bring out a methodological claim implicit in what I've said. Brandom often recommends his project by saying that if it succeeds, it provides a superior form of understanding. So he tells us to see how far he can get with this reconstruction of the abilities that constitute language use, to judge the theory by its fruits and let the proof be in the pudding. This reply does not register that the objection is also against the method. It entails that the form of understanding the theory would deliver, if indeed it did, would be inferior. Brandom proposes that we explain intentionality as a constellation of responsive dispositions. The explanation may deploy special concepts to describe the terms of the dispositions. We may have to speak of commitments and entitlements. It is the privilege of thinkers to have dispositions whose description requires these terms. But thinkers do not have something other than responsive dispositions. We do not need to think differently of the nexus of what affects them and what they do. That nexus is the same everywhere. It is a stimulus calling forth a response. Then we explain animal intentionality by the condition that the responsive dispositions be linked so as to form a toad cycle. For discursive intentionality, we impose further conditions. There must be dispositions to attribute commitments and entitlements that institute inferential and incompatibility relations. So here we comprehend something by representing it as certain elements satisfying certain conditions, and we independently understand the elements and the conditions. Brandom thinks that this is the highest mode of comprehension, the gold standard, he says. But this seems wrong to me. Comprehension of this form is imperfect. We explain X, we have to consider this very abstractly, that's what I do. We explain X as certain elements satisfying certain conditions. But now we can ask why, in a given case, given elements satisfy these conditions and satisfy them all. Now the answer is not contained in the nature of the elements. They may or may not satisfy them. So we must turn away from the elements and their unity to something other to explain why they have come together in the manner required for X. But then there is a sense in which it remains an accident that they have come together in this way. For the other thing to which we now turn, although it too may be explained by something other still, need not have been present, in the sense that the nature of X does not account for its presence. Consider this. A brick becomes loose in a storm, slides down the roof and falls. It hits someone who passes by and kills him. We can explain why he was killed. The brick hit him. We can explain why the brick fell. It became loose in the storm. It remains an accident that the man was killed. For what explains the fall of the brick does not explain its further causality. It's killing the man. It was not necessary that things come together in this way. Now note that it's different when I have loosened the brick. Calculating that the man will pass by at such and such a time, will be hit by the brick and killed, there will not be an accident that things have come together in this way. Now, explanation of something by something other, Hegel calls finite explanation. An infinite explanation, by contrast, explains the elements and the conditions in virtue of satisfying which they constitute X by the whole or unity they thus constitute. And then we need not turn to something other in order to comprehend why given elements satisfy the conditions and satisfy them all. The nature of X, which is internal to the elements that constitute it, accounts for that. And in this way, the nature of X here accounts for its existence. What is capable of this form of comprehension, Hegel calls an idea. The sentence I just read out before that is, in effect, a definition Hegel gives of the idea. The first kind of idea, he thinks, is a life form. Then there's knowledge, theoretical and practical, and finally, pure reason. If thought and language were such as to be understood in the inferior manner that Brandom thinks highest, then there would be no complete understanding of this object. But the intellect cannot be such an unworthy object of the intellect. If anything can be understood perfectly, then the intellect. Indeed, our reflections show that Hegel is right in thinking that intentionality, natural or rational, is an object of infinite explanation. Intentionality is not explained by responsive dispositions because a sequence of stimulus and response manifests intentionality only if the whole of the sequence explains its members, which whole then is a teleological process. An explanation by responsive dispositions is finite, explaining one thing, the response by another, the stimulus, which is not explained in the same act. While explanation of a manifold by a unity under which it is subsumed, as this form of explanation is exhibited in a teleological process, explanation of a manifold by a unity under which it is subsumed, that's infinite explanation. Now, I said that life, sentience, sapience signify a unity of what affects something and what it does. That's different from that signified by the concept of responsive disposition. We now see that this means that life, sentience, sapience are the object of a higher account than one that fits Brandom's gold standard. So there is no reason to be disappointed that an account of thought and language in terms of special responsive dispositions is inadequate to its object. An account of this form yields only finite comprehension. Brandom's wish to give an account of this form, which is motivated by his notion that it fits the gold standard of comprehension, leads him, I think, to a false account of logical vocabulary. He explains how logical vocabulary is contained in any vocabulary. The way in which it is contained is He explains that by reflecting on the conditional as the paradigmatic logical symbol. And the conditional, he says, can be introduced by algorithmic elaboration, or precisely a response substitution, from any inferential practice. But I think it's not possible to introduce conditionals by algorithmic elaboration from a given set of responsive dispositions. For the assertion that something follows from something is not a response to a stimulus. We can focus the issue by considering a parallel. Quine defines an observation sentence by its involvement in a responsive disposition. An observation sentence is tied to a set of stimuli that call forth assent to the sentence. Quine then introduces observation categoricals, reporting the regular coincidence of two stimuli, each associated with a given observation sentence. If we use phi and psi as observation sentence schemata, then the schema of an observation categorical is whenever phi, psi, or as Quine puts it, whenever this, that. Now, how might someone who can use observation sentences come to use observation categoricals? If the stimuli to which phi and psi are tied regularly come together, one will associate them. That is, one will, upon suffering the one, expect the other. One may then be said to express this expectation in doing something appropriate to the expected stimulus. So, for example, in the world of our cat, the sound Fleisch and salami on her food plate come together regularly. In the world of our, so she expects salami on her food plate when she hears Fleisch. She expresses this expectation by hurrying to her food plate. When she hurries to the plate, she manifests behavior that is informed by the regular coincidence of Fleisch and salami. This nexus of stimuli has sunk into her responsive dispositions. Thus, we might say that her behavior expresses this regular coincidence, but her behavior is not a case of using an observation categorical. As Quine explains, and I quote, an observation categorical is a generalized expression of expectation. Our cat expresses her expectation by hurrying to the food plate, but this is not a generalized expression. A generalized expression would express that, in general, she expects meat when she hears Fleisch. Whenever Fleisch, salami. The general is inside the expression. Quine suggests that the step from using observation sentences to using observation categoricals is small. But this cannot be true. If it were, why does our cat not take it? The small step is from being able to use the observation sentences to absorbing a regular nexus of stimuli to which they are tied in one's responsive dispositions. And this step our cat takes. It's a different thing to tie the use of a sentence no longer to a stimulus, but to a regular nexus of stimuli. An observation categorical is used not when this or that stimulus is suffered, but when this stimulus generally coincides with that. And here, when bears a different sense. In the observation sentence is used when the stimulus is suffered, it means at the time when. But this is not its meaning in the observation categorical is used when this stimulus and that stimulus regularly coincide. For there is no time when this happens. It is not something that happens. In using an observation categorical, we may say one responds to the fact that the stimuli regularly coincide. One responds to the regular coincidence of the stimuli. And this is what Quine must mean when he says that the categorical expresses that in general one expects the stimulus upon having suffered that one. But here the response is to something general. So the response is no longer to a stimulus. The general is not a stimulus. The general does not affect the senses. Now let us return to Brandom. He says a conditional describes or specifies the practice. the system of responsive dispositions from which it is elaborated. Now, if that is right, then its use is not an act of such a disposition. Responsive dispositions are described in statements saying what in general is done and when, and the conditions of the correct use of such a statement cannot be tied to a stimulus. The use of conditional is not a response to a stimulus and cannot be introduced by response substitution. Brandom's description of the stimulus to which a conditional is to be tied as a new response is ambiguous, but it must be read as describing something general, in which case it does not describe a stimulus. This is what he writes. What is required then is first that this new sort of response be hooked up responsively to the previously discriminable stimulus, so that it is asserted just in those cases where the inference from P to Q would have been responded to as a good one. Now, this may be read as a rule for the use of a specific formula, if P then Q. The rule would be that the formula is used to greet someone's moving from the assertion P to the assertion Q if that inference is a good one. It is then a form of saying yes to a move. A move can be given. A move is something that happens. A special form of yes that can only be used when the move is from P to Q. There will be a different rule for, say, the sentences S and R. The formula if S then R is especially yes said only of a move from S to R. These rules share a common form, but one is not conscious of this form in virtue of following rules of this form. Hence, if Brandom's description is read in this way, then the formula if P then Q does not say that the inference from P to Q is good. It does not express consciousness of the rule of the practice. Brandom's description of the stimulus to which the use of a conditional is to be a response may also be read as saying how, in general, formulae of the form if phi then psi are to be used. Such a formula is to be used when the inference from phi to psi is good, or equivalently, when one would treat a move from phi to psi as valid. Now here, there's not just sameness of rules, a grasp of which is not internal to an act of following any of them, but here the generality now is inside the rule and must be grasped by someone who follows it. In consequence, the when I just employed, when if phi then psi is to be used when the inference from phi to psi is good, this when does not mean at the time when. There is no time when an inference is good, and there is no time when one would treat a move as valid. So the conditions under which it is correct to use a conditional do not specify a stimulus to which the use of the conditional is a response. It is not possible to introduce logical vocabulary by algorithmic elaboration from a system of responsive dispositions. For the use of a conditional constitutes consciousness of something general. And while any algorithmic elaboration from responsive dispositions is a responsive disposition, consciousness of the general is not an act of responding to stimuli, for the general is no stimulus. This does not mean that logical vocabulary is not internal to any autonomous vocabulary. It means that if it is, then in no case is an assertion a response to a stimulus, and this, I think, is anyway the insight behind the claim that a system of Quinean observation sentences is not a language. An insight Brandom spoils when he thinks it means that the language needs further responsive dispositions, as opposed to something different altogether. But what? Let me indicate the direction of an account that would not be of the inferior form Brandom thinks is the gold standard, by returning to our reflections on the rational teleology of action. The unity of an intentional action is mediated by a representation of this unity from which its steps are derived. So the action does not just exhibit a unity, but the unity is such as to be known by the acting subject. That is, intentional action is self-conscious. An assertion, insofar as it expresses a judgment, is not an action, but it may share with action this formal character. Rules that govern assertion are such as to be known by the asserting subject. So if these rules describe a practice, then this practice is such as to be known by her who participates in it. What general statements describing the practice represent is such as to be known by the bearers of the practice. The practice is self-conscious. Then it is a small step from following the rules of the practice to representing them in speech. For the power to follow them, then, is a power to represent them, which power, however, is not a responsive disposition, but a self-conscious, spontaneous power. Of course, this concept, the concept of a self-conscious, spontaneous power, is obscure for us, not in itself, and must be developed. Not here. Brandom associates the thesis that modal and normative thought are internal to thought as such with Kant, and this seems right. But Kant explains in a different manner why thought, as such, contains modal and normative concepts. He derives their necessity from the objective validity of judgment. Judgment as such is objectively valid. It is and is understood by the judging subject to be valid of the object. This defines, according to Kant, the general form of judgment, the unity of representations in a judgment. The unity of representations in a judgment is the unity in virtue of which the judgment relates to the object in this way. Kant argues further that this unity, the objective unity of apperception, as he calls it, contains specific forms of unity, among them the unity of judgment that's designated by the concept of causality and lawful connection. This explains why Hume's atomism is wrong. It is wrong because the objective unity of apperception contains a unity among representations that involves necessary connections. Representations being related in this way is the form by which they relate to an object. Modal concepts are contained in the power of judgment because judgment is objectively valid and thus exhibits the unity in virtue of which it is so valid, which unity is the source of modal concepts. This is Kant. I'm only reciting Kant. Kant further argues that the objective unity of a perception, the unity of representations in virtue of which the judgments they constitute is objectively valid, is the unity in virtue of which they are self-conscious. The subject knows herself to be the subject of representations, not in virtue of any character of their content, but in virtue of their unity. And this is the same unity as the one by which they relate to an object. Now, as the unity in virtue of which judgments are objectively valid is such as to be represented by the subject, that unity may figure in the subject's thought as an imperative. The imperative form of the representation manifests an imperfection in the subject. Kant thinks it comes on the scene when something has gone wrong, as when the subject judges to be the case something that, according to what the subject takes herself to know, cannot be the case. So in this way, through this imperfection in the subject and the self-consciousness of the unity of a perception, the self-consciousness of judgment is the source of normative concepts. So we find that the very same formal character of judgment is the source of modal concepts and is the source of normative concepts. Not only are both modal concepts and normative concepts internal to judgment as such, they spring from the same source, the objective unity of a perception. Now let's compare this account, Kant's account of the unity of modal and normative thought with Brandom's. Kant's central term is judgment, Brandom's is assertion, but let us ignore this difference. Brandom introduces assertion as the act of a responsive disposition that is part of a system of such dispositions. The dispositions are special in that their terms, stimuli and responses, require fancy vocabulary for their description. Then he argues that such a system can be algorithmically elaborated so as to include dispositions whose acts can be recognized as acts of using modal and normative vocabulary. Finally, he maintains that through this vocabulary, the practice of assertion reveals itself to be a practice of subjects relating to objects. And in this way, Brandom thinks he has explained the objective validity of assertion in terms of a constellation of responsive dispositions. This is an explanation, he thinks, because an account of the concepts that the explanation deploys, the concept of a responsive disposition and the concepts of commitment and entitlement that describe the terms of the relevant dispositions, do not require a prior understanding of objective validity. Kant, by contrast, begins with the nature of judgment, which is objective validity. This is the principle. It explains. We understand it when we see what and how it explains. It explains in this way. The objective validity of judgment requires that judgments exhibit a certain unity, the objective unity of a perception. This unity is the source of modal and normative concepts, which thus are revealed to be internal to the power of judgment. So here, objective validity is not understood through independent ideas of the modal and the normative. Rather, these are understood through it. Objective validity is the principle of modal and normative thought and the principle of their unity. I want to end with pointing out a perhaps unintended consequence of Brandom's account of the subject, the judging subject. Brandom says that as incompatibility of determinations constitutes the identity of the object so determined, so does incompatibility of commitments constitute the identity of the subject so committed. This entails, I think, that Brandom and I are the same subject. Let me explain. If it's said that this is red and green, then something must be wrong. But if it's said that this is red and that's green, then everything may be right. As red and green are said of different objects, they are not in tension. Brandom suggests the parallel is this. If I say it is red and green, then something has gone wrong. But if I say it's red and Brandom says it's green, then nothing need have gone wrong. As different subjects make the judgments, they are not in tension. But this is not so. When I say it is red and Brandom says it is green, then something has gone wrong. I cannot say, look, everything's fine. After all, it's Brandom who says it's green, not I. I cannot say this because in judging, I claim objective validity, or equivalently, universal validity. I judge for any judger, and so does Brandom. Hence, there is a conflict in the judger, whom both Brandom and I represent. That the disagreements between us that have surfaced are disconcerting proves that Brandom and I are, in truth, the same subject. Thank you.
I think Dr. Brandom would like to say a few things in response. I don't know that, but...
Okay. Well, Sebastian is expressing a view that I think is genuinely deep and delineating a difference in approaches in philosophy that I think is genuinely deep. He's starting with a notion of form, of unity, of principle, connected to explanation that has its origins in Aristotle, that, as he suggested, animates the German idealists, and that he and my colleague Michael Thompson have been developing in the contemporary age. I actually think the next 20 years is going to be the site of an epic confrontation between this way of thinking about things and the attitude of murdering to dissect that I represent here. Though I don't usually use those examples. Well, what I think is at issue is two forms of explanation. He's quite right in seeing what I'm doing as a kind of bottom-up explanation by elements, by construction. He's opposing that to a kind of top-down explanation where you explain the elements in terms of the form, the unity, the principle of the whole thing that one is talking about. I think it's very important to try and understand the difference between and the relations between these different kinds of explanation. And it's Sebastian's work and Michael Thompson's work that begins to give me a glimmer about how Hegelian infinite explanations might contrast with the sort of finite ones that it's true I treat as the gold standard of understanding, not in the sense that I think everything can be understood that way, or that anything we can't understand that way must forever remain unintelligible. When I call it the gold standard, I mean when I can get a bottom-up constructive explanation from elements, I feel I understand things better than when I'm understanding it in the top-down way. Sebastian thinks that the most important things, the notion of life, the notion of intentional agency, the notion of language and of consciousness, of discursiveness, can in principle only be understood top-down in terms of the distinctive form that different statements, for instance, about living things get in virtue of the form of statements about the biological, and similarly for teleology, for agency, for discursiveness. I think he's probably right that to discuss something living or intentional as such, you've got to take into account this top-down way of thinking about it. You have to pick it out in a vocabulary, to pick it out as something living, as something intentional, as something rational, that you have to pick it out in the kind of vocabulary that he is describing for us. I think he may overlook the possibility that though these forms of explanation are different, and though the home language game of talk of living, acting, and thinking beings may well be in the sort of idiom that he's talking about, it's at least not obvious, and it may not be true, that you can't explain the applicability of top-down explanatory vocabularies in bottom-up terms. I don't know. Because I feel like I understand things better when I can understand them in bottom-up terms, I'm aiming to understand the applicability of the very terms he's talking about, but to explain them in another vocabulary, in a bottom-up vocabulary. And I think that Sebastian may systematically underestimate the extent to which new stuff happens when you put lots of more basic things together in new structures. He's confident that because the response of the poor cat that he threw into the fire, of bursting into flame, doesn't exhibit anything like the response of a living creature, never mind intentionality, that therefore no account that appeals to stimulus-response connections could ever exhibit the sort of phenomena that are described in the top-down vocabularies that he uses. But look, when the bolt falls off of my automobile, I can hold the thing up and say, boy, this is never going to take me to the airport in the morning. But it doesn't mean that putting a lot of little things that will never get you to the airport in the morning together in the right way doesn't add up to something that can take you to the airport in the morning. Now, of course, he's going to hasten to say, yes, but living things are not like that. Well, maybe so, maybe not. In particular, the sort of rational teleology that he's talking about, the sense in which there's goal-seeking behavior, one of the striking things about automata that can execute conditional branch schedule algorithms is that they're goal-seeking. That the exit condition is not, as he characterized it, just stopping to respond. it's sensible, I think it's correct to understand these systems as casting about, trying all sorts of things until and unless a certain goal situation is brought about. I think there is a kind of teleology that's exhibited by anything that's describable as having the structure of executing a test, operate, test, exit cycle. And in fact, we see in robots that instantiate such things, sophisticated goal-seeking behavior. Now again, he's going to insist that there's a big difference between what these artifacts do and what biological things do, and I don't mean to deny that. My account of what I call the level of practical intentionality and the way in which that might be practically elaborated, not now algorithmically elaborated, but practically elaborated into discursive intentionality, started off with living beings, the ones who really do have stimulus and response, their skillful doings as what they're doing as part of the lived life of an animal, and the way in which objects are involved in that and goals are sought. But I'm animated by an idea that I think was important to the American pragmatists, that there's a structure in that that we can see in living organisms, that we can see in evolution, that's common to the learning of individual organisms, to the evolution of species, that is common also, though this, for obvious reasons, was not a big theme for the classic American pragmatists, in these sort of goal-seeking machines, that genuine functional machines that are not simply stimulus-response engines, precisely because of the flexibility of conditional branch schedule algorithms that are tote cycles. And the idea was, although the details of these particular cases are quite different, living things do this differently, nonetheless, they can be described in a common vocabulary, a vocabulary of test, operate, test, exit cycles. And the challenge is to see whether the fact that they can be described in this common vocabulary is something that we can use to explain ultimately the applicability of the kind of more sophisticated top-down explanatory vocabulary that Sebastian is interested in. I still think that's an enterprise that's worth trying. And I think the sort of things he's led to say, an assertion is never a response to a stimulus. Well, I think it's enlightening to think about observation reports as inter alia responses to stimuli, to think of them as having a structure that involves exercising a reliable differential responsive disposition, something that that we reporters of things can share with merely sentient creatures like pigeons, but can also share with clanking artifacts like photocells hooked up to the right things, even though the instantiations of these are different and much richer vocabularies are applicable to us than to the pigeon, and to the pigeon than to the clanking artifact. But nonetheless, the reason colorblind people can't report the presence of red things is that they're not properly describable in terms of exercising reliable differential responsive dispositions to respond differentially to red things. That's an important thing to realize. Of course, we also want to talk about the significance of the fact that the reporters are applying concepts, and now we're in a different vocabulary. But the fact that that richer vocabulary applies and must apply for it to be an observation, I think doesn't undercut the intelligibility, the illumination that we get from also observing that we can describe what they're doing in a much sparer bottom-up vocabulary that already applies in other cases where the richer vocabulary doesn't. Let me end where Sebastian ended, with his proof that he and I are identical. Well, we have a lot in common, I'm glad to say. His argument turns on the observation that if he says the ball is red and I say the ball is green, there is something wrong. We're not just okay normatively. Maybe we're better off than if I say the ball is red and the ball is green. But it doesn't mean that we're off the hook just because it's the two of us. Well, in talking about this, let me substitute something we really do disagree about. I mean, I don't know what color he thinks the ball is, actually. He says that if I offer anything other than top-down explanations, what I'm explaining can't be a feature of life, of agency, of rationality. And I say I can explain the applicability of that terminology, even though my explanation is couched in a different vocabulary. Now again, if I said both those things, I'd be contradicting myself and I'd be in real trouble. And I acknowledge that there's still some problem when he and I disagree. But it's a different problem. And what defines the different subjects is the difference between the normative pickle that I'm in if I contradict myself and the normative pickle that we're in if we contradict each other. So all I need to claim, it seems to me, is that there's a normatively distinctive wrongness that is sufficient to distinguish the subjects. Now, it's a basic Hegelian claim that self-conscious individual subjects and their communities are simultaneously synthesized by reciprocal recognition. And a consequence of that is that in the end you can't understand the two sorts of normative wrongness, the kind distinctive of the individual subject, the sense in which I repel incompatible commitments, apart from the sense in which we repel incompatible commitments and acknowledge an obligation to sort things out ourselves. Those are two sides of one coin, and I didn't talk about the kind of normativity intelligible in principle only as part of a package that includes the kind I did talk about, and vice versa, that Sebastian rightly points to. Those differences are equally essential in this holistic structure. But as the differences between Sebastian's recommended methodology and mine call normatively for a fruitful dialogue between us and may eventually lead to a better understanding, I can only applaud the sense in which we are in the end identical.
Well, first of all, let me say thanks, Bob, for a really wonderful series of lectures. What I want to try to do now is to see if we can get just a little bit further with this issue as to whether there's really any disagreement between us about the issue of representationalism, whether there's some sense in which you're more of a representationalist than I want to be. And I thought perhaps I could try to do it by offering a kind of two-step diagnostic test. The first step is a kind of question about whether you allow something in your general scheme. And what's at issue is whether you allow that, in principle, we might come across a group of speakers who were using a vocabulary which we couldn't use because we were either not in the habit of, or more interestingly, unable to engage in some practice which was PV necessary for the use of that vocabulary. Call that a P inaccessible vocabulary. So it's P inaccessible from our point of view because, let's say, we can't engage in the practice which is PV necessary for it. Diagnostic test. And there the question is, whether the kinds of things that you want to say about intentional relations kind of coming out in the end, semantic relations, in the normal case, are also applicable in this case. So it's the question as to whether, from our perspective, the perspective we'd have on this p-inaccessible vocabulary, it makes any sense at all to talk about the semantic relations of that vocabulary to the world. Now, on the one hand, there might be a view, and I think this is what I'd want my view to be, that given that, as you yourself have put it earlier, the real home of notions like reference is in the business of, as it were, mapping another's commitments into one's own vocabulary. And this is going to be a case in which it's not possible because of the fact that that vocabulary is p-inaccessible. This is a case where the idea of saying anything about the reference of terms in this p-inaccessible vocabulary just doesn't make sense. Then, on the other hand, I mean, the other sort of option sort of allows the question as to what these people are referring to in their, or what the terms in the p-inaccessible vocabulary, what they stand in semantic relations, does make sense, even if perhaps epistemologically it's harder for us to answer, but it still makes sense. And I see that as a more representationalist position.
Okay, I'm probably not getting the sense of inaccessibility that you want. Here's a case where it seems to me, they clearly could have a vocabulary that's inaccessible to us. That's one where they've got perceptual abilities that we don't have, and so have observational uses of terms, which counts as a vocabulary for me, that since we just can't see that stuff or hear that stuff, whatever, we can't deploy that vocabulary. We can't make observational use of those things. Now, in that case, we still might have a perfectly good theoretical understanding of what they're responding to. It's just we can't non-inferentially do it. Maybe we can't even build instruments to detect it, even though we've got theories that tell us what it is, but it can be a long way from the theories to the instruments. Now that seems, if that's good enough for it to be inaccessible, then it doesn't seem to me that that has any particular consequences for making it difficult for us to characterize the semantics of what they're doing. We understand the genus. We can refer to the objects that they can refer to, and that all seems intelligible. But I take it you wanted something stronger than that. You wanted something like, we can't even pick out the objects that we would have to take them to be talking about.
Yes, I want a case which kind of puts a bit more meat on the bones of the idea that I think you yourself kind of expressed in the discussion yesterday, that in some sense the facts come with the vocabularies. And so that the idea I want is that there's, from their point of view, there's a domain of facts which, as it were, simply isn't in the picture from our point of view. So that the exercise of trying to line up the facts as we see them with the facts as they see them simply doesn't make sense in this case.
Okay.
Now, I mean,
as long as that's a sufficiently limited range of things, I don't see any problem with acknowledging that, that there could be talk we just can't talk because there's collateral commitments we can't share and so on. And so we can't actually use the vocabulary they've got. And so can't ourselves pick out things that they would be expressing or referring to.
Okay.
Hugh, I think I'm going to have to give somebody else a go. A lot of hands went up. Over there was next. Time is getting short. Can I ask questioners to keep their questions compact, please?
Yeah. I actually wanted to just, even though Bob actually was happy to acknowledge that in the sense in which they're the same subject, but I think it's actually the accusation was just actually a sort of misreading of Bob's actually intention, because, I mean, the way we can tell that they're two different subjects is because when we hear two utterances, it's red and it's green, the way we know that they belong to two subjects is because it's the possibility of one being commitment, the other being entitlement. I mean, if they were issued from the same subject and this weren't there wouldn't be a possibility of. No, well, but that's actually just a quick remark. My real question is following. It's just.
I'm sorry, one question, please. Bob, you want to respond to that?
Okay. Well, I just want to say, I mean, I think that's right. The point is Sebastian could be entitled to his view. I'm entitled to mine. If either of us said both of them, we wouldn't be entitled to them. I mean, I think he's going to think that's question begging, but that's the difference.
Can I ask my real question?
No, I'm sorry. You should have asked the real question first. Mark Lance was next. Ask your real question first.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out if you need a little more here. So you say, okay, so taking a dog judgment to be incompatible with a fox judgment is taking them to refer to a represented object. Well, that can't be quite right, right? Because if I say the mother is a dog and the son of the mother is a fox, then that's incompatible. So you can have incompatibilities that have different subjects. Sometimes you can have incompatibilities that only work if the subjects are different in the right way. The mother is precisely 25 years old is incompatible with the daughter is precisely 25 years old, but if they were the same subject, they wouldn't be anymore. And in other cases, it depends on sameness, but sameness in a more specific way. You know, my car is lifting off the road is incompatible with my car is under control, but my plane is lifting off the road isn't incompatible with my plane is lifting off the road. So, at the risk of invoking Quine in the Salarzian holy place, I mean, it seems to me that it's right to say that objects are the locus of the repulsion of property or predicatival incompatibilities, but only in the context of a practice in which we can make explicit quantificational claims. It's when I can say things like, there exists an X such that this, then I know that the such that this is doing all the inferential work. When I say for all X, Fx, arrow not Gx, then I know that I'm expressing an incompatibility of property.
Okay, well, you're certainly right that it's more complicated than the simple examples I had that I used to try and make the point. And you're also right that what we're going to need to understand the other cases is materially good inferences that connect, for instance, what species the mother is to what species the son is, and so on. I would resist, however, saying that we have to have quantificational vocabulary sufficient to make explicit in the form of claims those properties of material inference. I think it's good enough if we in fact have attitudes towards those material inferences. I think we have to be able to make sense of singular terms in their primary occurrence in non-quantificational context in order to make sense of the quantificational expressions which, along with conditionals and so on, we'll use to make explicit then those proprieties of material inference. So I'm committed to being able to make use of those uses of those occurrences of singular terms first, before we've added the quantificational vocabulary to the language. So I want to have a very unquinian picture of that. And the story in Chapter 6 of making it explicit about singular terms is supposed to be the cache for that.
So I want to take up this issue that you were discussing right at the end of your comments on the difference between undertaking incompatible commitments and having different people with incompatible commitments. By inviting you to link up some of the things that you've discussed today in Lecture 6 with some of the things that you discussed in making it explicit in Chapter 8. So obviously in making it explicit there's a conspicuous lack of discussion of modality. You don't discuss modality in making it explicit, at least not officially, but you do here. Another difference is in the package of discussions of intentional vocabulary. So intentional vocabulary in making it explicit comes with the practice of keeping two sets of books on the entities around you, and then that grounds the notion of objectivity, maybe an intersubjective notion of objectivity. Whereas today, we have intentional vocabulary linked with the practice of deontic status rectification, upkeep. So maybe a dynamic notion of objectivity. So are these two different concepts? Have you changed your mind about the way to explain intentional vocabulary? Yeah, so.
Okay, good. I mean, you will have noticed that intentional vocabulary actually comes into the story that I told today only in the form of conditions of applicability of it. That is, I'm interested in what it is to deploy a vocabulary and saying, well, if we can understand that in terms of the process of rectifying our beliefs, and so the necessity of acknowledging normative obligations that are constrained by relations of material inference and incompatibility, then we can understand why, by acknowledging those norms, we also count as purporting to refer to or represent objects. So that what intentional vocabulary is applicable is not only going to be something that says we believe that such and so, what I was calling the expressive or that intentionality, which you can at least get a grip on just in terms of articulation by relations of material incompatibility and inference, but also representational or of intentionality, and the intentional vocabulary that says, he believes of foxes that they're nocturnal omnivores is something that I think we can understand in terms of that process of rational rectification of our beliefs having an aspect that's made explicit by normative vocabulary and one that's made explicit by modal vocabulary. That process of rational rectification is going to involve, when we fill it all in, an interpersonal dimension. I acknowledged invoking Hegel's notion of reciprocal recognition in response to Sebastian. The particular form that comes out in making it explicit is the keeping two sets of books, the different social perspectives on things. And so that's just a dimension that I suppressed during, for the purposes of making this different point, which doesn't get made in making it explicit.
There were several more hands that I didn't get at. Okay, John McFarlane was very, very quick on the draw there. Excellent. I really commend this.
Okay, so I want to understand the picture on page 49, and in particular the bottom part with arrow number 8 of VP sufficiency. And I think this is related to the unclarity I was having about VP sufficiency before. So first, what vocabulary exactly is V intentional? So presumably things like said that and said about, but you need more than that to say anything. Second, does this, whatever this ends up being, V intentional, does that vocabulary really specify the whole autonomous discursive practice, P sub ADP? You have it pointing to that whole rectangle. Does it really suffice to pick that out? In other words, are you saying there's an intentional speech, a speech in intentional vocabulary you can give that would uniquely specify a set of discursive practices? And third, why is there no triangle on the bottom the way there is on the top? Surely, since PADP is everything, that would suffice for algorithmic elaboration of whatever practices would be necessary for deploying V sub-intentional. So I wondered whether there's a reason that there wasn't a triangle on the bottom. So those are the three things.
Okay, well, for the last question, no. There's, lots of relations that obtain that don't get in here. There was nothing that was a resultant specifically of that, so that just isn't in the picture. The question about the VP sufficiency, that's a difficult question. I'm not sure what to say about it. I mean, the thought that's behind this is, yeah, you need to have a language in which you can say what people are saying. So you've got to be able to specify both the contents that they're deploying in the autonomous discursive practice and what they're doing in saying it. So you have to have both enough vocabulary to express the content clauses, what comes behind the that clauses, what comes inside the of clauses. We're thinking because we got both the expressive that and the representational of, and the claims that, believes that vocabulary that's saying what speech acts they're performing with it. So, I mean, I don't know sort of what all the speech acts are, for instance, and it's a little bit odd that the intentional vocabulary, I mean, also, anyway, it's something not represented here, that you're going to have a content clause for every sentence in the autonomous discursive practice. So there's a sort of reciprocal containment of this intentional vocabulary and the autonomous discursive practice. So that, I mean, that's the way I was thinking about what goes in that oval.
I definitely saw some other hand. Yeah, okay. Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I don't know your name.
My question concerns the relation of practical intentionality to semantic intentionality. I take it we only have full-fledged intentionality if we have propositional attitudes in play. And on your theory, notions of propositional attitudes are only applicable to language users. So only on your account, practical intentionality would not be proper intentionality. Given that, that I wonder what to make of your thesis that semantic intentionality is a sophisticated case of practical intentionality. For it seems to be claim something stronger than that practical intentionality is just a necessary condition for semantic intentionality. On the other hand, the most stronger thesis in the vicinity seem to be, given that practical intentionality is no intentionality at all, to have a reductive account of intentionality in no-intentional terms. And this is something you seem to not to want to commit yourself to. So my question is what to make of your thesis that semantic intentionality is a sophisticated case of practical intentionality.
Okay, there is a bit of drift in my terminology here. In making it explicit by intentionality, I mean discursive or semantic intentionality, the kind that matters for sapience. Here, in part to aiming to bring on board some of the insights of the classical American pragmatists and of the people who don't draw as sharp a line as I do between discursive intentionality and what the rest of the animal kingdom is able to do. I say, well, look, if you, as I would not have in making it explicit, think of intentionality so broadly that it's directedness at an object, then it certainly would be silly to deny to claim that anything that didn't have a language couldn't be directed at objects, that the bird couldn't be onto its nest, the predator isn't directed at the prey, and so on. So what can we make of that? I say, well, it seemed to me that Dewey, for instance, gives us a good sense in which the skillful doings of animals in their proper environments gets them directed at objects. Those objects are both inputs to them and outputs they're working on, and you can't properly describe, you can't give a VP sufficient specification of what they're doing without mentioning those objects. So that was the sense in which those were thick things. Now, I wasn't trying to give a reductive account of the progress from that kind of practical intentionality to the semantic one. I sort of pointed to an intermediate thing where if that being onto the objects, if that sense in which you're responding to the objects and then working on them and responding to the effects of your working on them is essentially mediated by states that are articulated by standing in relations of material inference and incompatibility, not saying what that consists in now, and that's why it's not a reductive account. But if they are essentially mediated by that, which again means you can't give a VP sufficient specification of those practices without mentioning the relations of material inference and incompatibility, then that's going to be a form of discursive being onto things, which we can see as standing in relation to and sort of growing out of as a special case of the practical one, just by describing it in the way that I just have. So that was the kind of illumination I was looking for.
Well, if there's no one else, I guess you get to ask your real question.
So as I understand, I want to address some substantive issues in lecture 6, which is I discern actually two strands of thoughts there. One is sort of epitomized by the thought that somehow this transcendental unity of perception, sort of unpacking of that, and that seems that's one thing. Second thing is somehow the correlation between the objective modality on the one hand and this subjective one, and I see them as very different theses. I think the first unpacking of the transcendental unity as being transcendental, as being sort of grounding the semantic of relation, requires only the second order norm of correcting your modify your commitments so as to avoid certain situations where you've got two kinds of attitudes which you cannot take on at the same time, right? But it doesn't require any sort of substantive modal notion of that incompatibility relation, because the Mickey Mouse example can be modified to where the relation is just purely regularity relations, and the story. I mean, there's no. I don't know to what extent I want to elaborate the story, but the idea is it seems that there's no way to distinguish the weak sense and the strong sense of incompatibility relation, whether it is a really law-like connection there, or what is the regularity relation?
Oh, okay, I think. I mean, one of the enterprises is to say, well, what is it to synthesize a rational unity of apperception? And that's a matter of acknowledging the normative responsibility that I called ampliative to fill in the material inferential consequences, and the one I called critical, which is to repel the subjectively incompatible commitments. And then I wanted to say, well, how can we understand how a rational unity of apperception like that, the norms that govern the process of synthesizing one, could deserve to be called a transcendental unity of apperception or transcendental synthesis, something that puts you, at least purportedly, in contact with objects, that at least purports to be representational, not just that intentionality, but makes the intentional representational vocabulary applicable. And there the claim was that although in some sense all that's going on is the acknowledgement of the subjective norms, we can also see that that very same process that is taking or treating two propositional contents as incompatible in the normative sense is treating two properties as incompatible in the modal sense. That's just another way of thinking about that very same process. Now, I think that the reason that the idealists, Hegel, who I thought understood Kant in the way I'm describing, thought idealism was a good way of thinking about this, was because there's a certain priority to the process that the subject is engaged in the order of understanding of all of this. So, you know, there is a certain sort of natural priority to the process the subject is going through. That's what makes intelligible both the normative and the modal characterizations of things. Now, if I heard you right just at the end, you were worried about whether, well, did it have to be modal, or did it have to be counterfactual supporting in order to, on the objective side, or could we have mere regularities? And there I just want to revert to the earlier arguments that I had, that the material inferences that articulate the conceptual contents really have to be thought of as counterfactually robust in order to be conceptually contentful, so that updating can take place. You've got to associate ranges of counterfactual robustness with the material inferences and incompatibilities that you've got in order for the updating process to be intelligible.
I think on that note, this brings to an end